This is the first Awarelogue alert that is being conducted by the Awarelogue Initiative in order to take up a pressing international relations issue, given a certain development in the South Asian region. We're extremely honored to have with us a specialist who has dealt with this particular area, who is the director of the Center for Afghanistan, Middle East and Africa at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad, Pakistan. Thank you very much, Amina Khan, for joining us all the way from Islamabad. It's been a very busy 24 hours probably of several days now since there have been various developments at a very rapid pace. We're seeing so much of change taking place, perhaps on an hourly basis. How smooth is the power transition in Afghanistan at this moment?
Well, I think it's very difficult and too soon to tell because it is ongoing. The latest report is very unfortunate, and that is that President Ghani has fled the country. Maybe we shouldn't use the word fled, but that is what the Afghans are calling it themselves. And I think this is very unfortunate because once the agreement was signed between the Americans and the Taliban, while a lot of us had reservations regarding the agreement and key aspects necessary for peace that were largely ignored, and the fact that Kabul was ignored. Once the agreement was signed, I think President Ghani had a historic opportunity to engage with the Taliban, and therefore both sides should have delivered. Unfortunately, we saw President Ghani time and again, throw a spanner in the works and create unnecessary hurdles. And the fact that he's been resisting, the Taliban, who, let's be very honest, were legitimized and have been legitimized by the Americans, and then the region followed. Therefore, I think he should have engaged with them, and I think there could have been a more peaceful and honorable way of exiting the country than having to leave. Now, coming to the question of the current situation, well, I think the Taliban have been very, very smart. They haven't repeated the mistakes of the past, and as you've seen, they have been, taking over Afghanistan in a very different manner, moving from the north, pushing towards the south. And we haven't really seen much the bloodshed that I think was being envisaged because, again, the Afghan National Security Forces are not really putting up a very bold front. They certainly can't. They're unfortunately no match, despite the fact that, they have been trained and been given, sophisticated weapons. They are no match for the Taliban, who are a guerrilla, group, and they've been waging war against one of the most sophisticated armies in the world, which is the Americans. So currently, from what I know, it has been relatively smooth and peaceful. Of course, you're going to have clashes there and here and there, but the fact that there should be no civilian casualties. And the Taliban, I think, have been saying this time and again to their fighters that they should ensure that there is no bloodshed. And I think this is very important. And if the Taliban are sincere in their commitment towards Afghanistan, then they need to ensure that their fighters do not commit bloodshed.
Amina, we're also hearing a lot about the Taliban itself. They're coming out, they're speaking, their spokesman is being heard a lot on lots of media institutions. Are we seeing transform Taliban? You've been studying this group, you've been studying this country. Could you tell us a bit more about them and what exactly are we going to see in this new version? Is it a new version? Is it the same Taliban?
Well, look, one certainly hopes that it is a new version, because if you look at the leadership, they're not, the leaders of, say, those that took part in, some of them are, but not majority of them are the ones that took part in the Mujahideen. Number two, I think it's important to realize that maybe if the group did not want to evolve, they have been forced to evolve. You see, Afghanistan may have been at turmoil with itself and the world outside by in far largely, but the Afghanistan of today is not what it was 2 decades ago. The people have evolved. And I think the Taliban realized this, that in order to have, some presence in the future polity of Afghanistan, the group had to evolve. Now, look, the Taliban have learned the art of diplomacy. I mean, they have been engaging with countries like Russia, the same country that invaded Afghanistan and the same country that the Taliban were, they were a part of the resistance against the Soviets. Do remember that it was the Russians that was able to bring the Taliban onto the negotiating table. And the Taliban used, in fact, the Russia platform to showcase their policy back in 2018 and in 2019. More so, the Taliban have been engaging with Iran as well. And the fact that it's the same Taliban. Now, when we talk about the peace deal or the peace agreement, remember, it was the Taliban that initially reached out to the Americans and said that, they wrote a letter to the American public and the senators, and they said they wanted to engage in a peace process. Now, having said all that, yes, there is a fair amount of suspicion that does come with the group, certainly because of the policies they had in the past, particularly their very, very strict interpretation of Islam and Sharia. But we've seen the Taliban reassuring not only the Afghans, but of course the international community that they're going to honor their agreements when it comes to women's rights, human rights. And look, the fact that the Taliban have been talking about a nationalistic government, a nationalistic constitution, talking about allowing women to go to school, to marry whoever they want to, for them to get educated. Yes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Once they do come into power, whichever form it is, whether it's through an interim setup or whatnot, we will see. But I think another important factor that will have to make sure the Taliban change their ways is that they cannot operate in isolation. They need recognition and support from regional and extra-regional countries. And no regional country is going to support the Taliban if they go back to their old ways. So I think the Taliban know that this change has come about. It's a forced change, but they will have to, evolve, at least when it comes to their, implementation of policies in Afghanistan. This is pivotal.
When we talk about, you mentioned at the beginning also that Afghan president had left the country. We also understand the speaker has come to Islamabad. A plane has landed with more leaders coming. Do you expect more coming in the next few days?
Well, look, Pakistan, if you remember, I think it's about 3 weeks back, had decided to hold a peace conference where we had invited all the different political factions in Afghanistan to take part. And remember, these are the same political factions that took part in the Moscow talks of 2018 and 2019. Now, I keep on referring back to the Moscow talks because I think they were pivotal when we look at the whole Afghan equation. Because not only did the Taliban showcase their policies and what they envisaged for the future of Afghanistan, but it was the first time where officially different political factions engaged with the Taliban, and we heard talks of this inclusive political setup for the future of Afghanistan. Now, from what I know is that while these different political faction leaders are here in Pakistan, they are the same ones that have been engaging with the Taliban, and they could be a part of the future political setup. Whether it's in term or not is a different matter, but there is a lot of talk of an inclusive political setup, and the Taliban have said that they cannot rule in totality. They will have to be a power sharing setup, and I think this is what they are here for. And the whole, you see, it doesn't matter whoever rules Afghanistan as long as it has the support of the masses, and as long as there is a peaceful transition. I think that is pivotal. And it is, again, as I said in the beginning, very unfortunate. I think President Ghani had a historic opportunity to be remembered as someone who, was committed to the future of Afghanistan. And the fact that he's not been able to do this is very unfortunate for the Afghan people.
I mean, Pakistan shares a very long border. I mean, the longest border with Afghanistan. And I do believe one of the main entry points has been closed off as well.
Oh.
What impact is this going to have on your country, especially those areas along the border with Afghanistan?
Now, unfortunately, as you said, the relationship has been strained, to say the least, and it has been embedded in this vicious blame game that has been counterproductive, and it really hasn't helped either side. And unfortunately, because the relationship has always been viewed through the security lens, where if you had positive developments on the peace process, the relationship was good, and the minute something went down, you had accusations coming from Kabul. Now, as a result, other important contours of their bilateral relationship have largely been ignored, and I'm talking about trade, connectivity. And who is the sufferer? It's the common, the ordinary man. And as you said, when the border is closed, whether we like it or not, but while Afghanistan has tried to explore other avenues, such as, their air freight corridor with India and Chabahar, the cheapest and the easiest route for the common Afghan is through Pakistan. And it's the common man that has suffered. Now, temporarily, yes, the border was functioning, but because of COVID and of course, because of the situation, there is concern in regional countries that there might be a huge exodus of refugees. I personally feel that that is not going to happen, because if we were meant to witness this huge exodus, it should have happened before, because the Taliban have been taking over swiftly. one just hopes right now that whichever political dispensation comes into power in Afghanistan, it should be neutral, and it should be aware of each country's concerns. For example, Pakistan's primary concern, we all know, in Afghanistan has been India, but there is a realization within Pakistan that Afghanistan is an independent sovereign country that has the right to have relations with all countries, including India. So as long as India is not used against Pakistan, and similarly, no elements within Pakistan use the Afghan territory against India, I think there is a workable solution. Because look, Afghanistan, one is hoping, is a regional roundabout. It is a key connectivity route towards Central Asian, republics, and I think it's so important for Pakistan because we've signed the CPEC agreement, and we need it to be implementalized, and that can only happen when there is some semblance of stability in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. I mean, just to touch on a socio-economic issue and just to move into that arena, Malala has come out and spoken against the Taliban in terms of women's rights, women's education, girls' education. How concerned are you about it being set back in time in terms of the progress that had been made? Do you see this going to have a huge impact? I know that the Taliban spokesman has already gone on record saying that women can travel around alone. They're not going to be restricted. They're not going to have to leave home with someone. Questions arise over wearing of the burqa, etc., and those concerns might come up. How concerned are you about women's rights and girls' education in Afghanistan at this point?
No, look, certainly. Look, while there might not have been a lot of gains, but certainly during the past 20 years, there have been, fundamental changes when it comes to women's rights and education and whatnot. And as a woman, of course, these are issues that really concern me because, if we go by what Taliban saying, we talk about Islam. Islam gives women rights at all levels, whether it's their right to choose their future husband, education, the right to property, inheritance, and all these things. And yes, again, you see the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So once the Taliban come in, then they start implementing these policies, one will see. But the fact that Taliban have begun to talk about these things is a change in itself. I'm not saying that they deserve a pat on the back, but the fact that they've acknowledged that, they need to address women's rights and they need to honor women's rights is a positive step in the right direction. And God forbid, if they do alter and they do not fulfill their promises and their honors towards women, education, human rights, and whatnot, I think they know that the region will not give them that political, that economic, that developmental support they so badly need to remain relevant. Because no country would ever, as I said, want the Taliban to rule the way they did. Or nor, again, the major fear is that if they start ruling the way they did, that is going to transgress into, the bordering regions, and of course Pakistan, Iran, the Central Asians, the Chinese. Russians are equally worried. So, and if the Taliban do this and they implement this change, they're not going to do this as a means of surrender or weakness, but I think it's going to be to further legitimize their cause and further ensure they have a space for themselves in the future polity of Afghanistan. This is something they need to do. And just one more point. I think it's very contradictory of the Taliban if they go back to their old ways, because they're sitting in Doha, their children are going to mixed educational institutions. And remember, this is the Taliban that have been living in Doha for more than 20 years now. So this new leadership, I think there is a change in them. But again, I'm not going to speak for them because it is too soon. One will have to see, how things turn out.
Definitely. Going on to the side of trade, I mean, Afghanistan has been very well known for the opium that comes out of that country, which feeds into the drug trade. And this was something that we saw at a heightened pace during the time of the Taliban in the past. Are you concerned that this could be resurrected once again?
Well, look, if we go back to the root of the Taliban, initially in the 90s, opium production and trade had reduced to about 41%, and these are figures that come out from the UN. The fact is that everybody has been utilizing and gaining from this illegal trade, even certain members within the Taliban. And let's not forget the Islamic State and the other terrorist groups that have been operating in Afghanistan. But I think certainly, to be very honest, this is a factor that will come in. It's not amongst the priorities. This is something that will have to be dealt with because regional countries are very concerned, of course, about having instability on the borders, and then you're going to have illegal trade of arms, of drugs, and weapons. So it is something that is an issue of concern for the regional countries, but I don't think it will be a priority agenda for the incoming government. But it is something that can be, obviously addressed for sure.
Mhm. Going into the fora of foreign policy and what they're doing, we've already had the Germans announcing that they're closing their embassy in Kabul from today. Are we likely to see more countries pulling out? They've already started sending their officials out of the country. Plane loads are leaving, but apparently the airport is also under siege. That's not very clear at the moment. But diplomatically, are we expecting recognition of this new transitional government if there is a peaceful transition?
Well, first, it's very interesting, you see, because it was the international community that came into Afghanistan with very little support and, consultation from the regional countries. And it's interesting now that all the international community has conveniently abandoned Afghanistan, if I may say, and the onus has been put on the regional countries to deal with the situation, which I think is very disingenuous. I think it's the commitment of the international community, particularly the Americans and NATO members, who, whether they were forced into it or not, but they did support the Americans to leave Afghanistan once there is some sort of semblance of stability. This is so important. And this also means brokering a deal between the different political factions, which includes the Taliban. Now, we're hearing of this peaceful transition of power, but it has to be implemented in letter and spirit. This is important. Number one. Number two, naturally, what we're hearing is that President Ghani obviously agreed to step down, or whether has been forced, he's fled the country, and that now a delegation is going to go to Doha, where there will be this peaceful transition of power. Naturally, if that happens, the international community will recognize this, new, if it's an interim setup or this new political framework. I think it's important that if this framework delivers, and that primarily means that there is no bloodshed, then certainly there will be recognition. But again, look, I think the onus is also on the Afghans. Regional countries and the international community can only do so much. What is the biggest stumbling block? Let me just say here, that has prevented peace so far after the Doha Agreement. It's been that the Taliban and Kabul have not been willing to accommodate and compromise with one another. So a major factor that has always been missing from this equation, I think, is national reconciliation and national integration. And if we see this inclusive interim setup, and if we see it working, because remember, it's one thing to form a government, it's another to make it work. We saw the government of national unity that was never a government of national unity. So certainly there will be recognition if it is done in a peaceful manner.
China is very concerned about what is going on, and you saw China also reaching out to the Taliban. Delegations met with their foreign minister because they are concerned about other sensitive issues within their own territory, and the fact that certain terrorist outfits could be operating out of Afghanistan in order to attack them. How are we going to see China getting involved in this picture? And aren't we going to see a situation in which the Americans are going? China has a vacuum. Is China going to try to fill that vacuum?
Well, look, the Americans, I think, have already gone, to be very honest with you. Okay. And the fact that if they have a couple of troops on the ground does not mean they're staying. It is interesting. I think China initially was very reluctant to openly, engage in Afghanistan. They've been engaging with Afghan political factions, whether it's the government, whether it's other political factions or the Taliban, for more than a decade now, but it is not something that has been known. Do remember that China, I think, is the best suited regional player to play the role of a regional interlocutor and maybe even head a regional framework or regional monitoring mechanism. Why do I say this? Because the Taliban are viewed very positively in Afghanistan as a neutral player. They do not have any historical baggage that, say, Pakistan, Iran, or the Russians have. So I think the Chinese are best suited, number one. Number two, the Chinese, the fact that they've been engaging with the Taliban, but the fact that they openly, very recently, officially, if you saw, the visit of the Afghan Taliban delegation to Beijing, where the foreign minister Wang Yi openly welcomed them, I think that in itself was legitimization. Do remember that the Taliban have openly said that they welcome the Chinese as a facilitator. Remember, the Chinese played a major role in the ceasefires that Pakistan brokered in 2018, 2019 during Eid holidays. So that's number one. And number two, I think the Chinese feel that the Taliban are maybe a more reliable stakeholder because Taliban have never really attacked Chinese assets or influences in Afghanistan, and they have also openly welcomed the larger BRI and Afghanistan's prospects of joining CPEC, which, by the way, President Ghani was not very keen about because he kept on adding the connotation or linking it to India's access to the Wagah border and then extending it. So I think we're going to see more of China. And let us be honest, this is the first time where China has played a major role in a country outside its region. I'm talking about more of the Taiwan aspect. So I think yes, China, we're going to see a lot more of that. And I think China has found so far a reliable partner, with the Taliban, because the Taliban also, one more point, has, assured them that they will not support any elements that are close to the ETIM. And I think this is a major assurance that has given the Chinese that confidence to engage with the Taliban.
Amina, if we go back to 1979, we saw, was it the Afghan government at the time that invited the Soviet Union in? Was it a Soviet invasion? That's a situation, it's a hypothetical debate there, I guess. But at the end of the day, the Americans turned to Pakistan at that point. They became closer to Pakistan. Sanctions had been imposed on your country before that, but General Zia-ul Haq was able to change the tide, and you had America working very closely with Pakistan. Are we going to see the change in the equation between America and Pakistan at this time?
I have a lot of reservations regarding what happened in the 70s and the fact that I think, the role that we played, because honestly, the repercussions of that we face today and the role that we played in those days, it's very convenient that, the Americans, they funded the entire, jihad. The UAE recognized the Taliban, so did the Saudis after that. And a lot of Muslim countries played a role in that. But whenever you talk about the Taliban, unfortunately, Pakistan is always attached to it. And I've always said that we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't in Afghanistan. Now, with the Americans, it's unfortunate, but the relationship has always been very short-sighted. It's been transactional, and it has always been viewed through the security prism, and that is Afghanistan. As I said, even now, if you see, it was Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban has been known since day one. We have never kept it a secret. So our relationship has been known, but remember, it was not Pakistan or Pakistan's recognition that legitimized the Taliban. The day the Americans signed the agreement with the Taliban, that is when the group was legitimized. But since then, you've been seeing the entire blame that if Pakistan stops, providing support to the Taliban, there will be peace in Afghanistan. No, not at all. I don't deny that the border is porous and there may be movement to and fro. I also don't deny that there might be certain elements within our country that do support the group. But remember, look, the Taliban, bulk of the fighters are fighting in Afghanistan. Number one. Number two, they have been recognized regionally as well as internationally. They're sitting in Doha. And also, the fact that the peace process could not pick up is not because Pakistan did not want it. It's because both sides were not willing to accommodate each other. Now, coming to your question on the Americans, we have seen a lot of scapegoatism and all the blame has been put on Pakistan. I think it's very naive. I think it's very disingenuous of the Americans to do this because they know the relationship we have with the Afghans, which is extremely strained. So when the Americans also try to push the onus on Pakistan, it emboldens even people within Afghanistan. Now, I think it is important that while Pakistan obviously wants to broaden its relationship with the Americans, I still feel that it's going to be limited. It's going to be still looked at through the prism of Afghanistan and security and counterterrorism measures. And again, all of this revolves around Afghanistan. But I think it's naive of the Americans to do so because I think they need to engage with Pakistan, particularly because of our close relationship with China and because of China's whole policy towards China, which isn't very forthcoming because you see there is, that antagonism going on. So I think they should engage with Pakistan. They should broaden the contours of their bilateral relationship. It is essential and not just view it through the Afghan prism.
Finally, Amina, just to go back to a point that you made, extra regional powers created a mess. Within the region, we've got to try to help a neighboring country now sort it out, because it's going to have a ripple effect on us. What do you see as some of the most direct impacts that will affect our countries? It happened in the at the end of the 70s into the 80s. We saw relations being impacted with Pakistan, with India. We saw developments even in Sri Lanka. We saw the Russian involvement, the Soviet Union involvement in Afghanistan had a lot of other domino effects across our region. What do you see happening right now?
Well, I personally think this is the first time, I think, in the history of the region where you've got all the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan on the same page. And by immediate, I mean Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, and the Central Asians. And then if we go further off, even to include, Turkey, where they have always envisaged, political stability in Afghanistan, a political settlement that recognizes the Taliban. Also, the fight against terrorist groups, particularly the ISKP, the the Islamic Movement of Kurdistan Province, which is a major threat to all these regional countries. So despite their previous divergences and differences, they're on the same page. And I think these countries are going to work together, to try and bring some semblance of stability, because you see, I think they've also realized that they cannot depend on the international community to time and again come in. It is time for regional ownership and recognition. And we've seen this. All these countries have been playing a major role by engaging with both Kabul as well as the Taliban. Now, the question over here is, you mentioned this with the Chinese as well, are they going to come and replace the Americans? Certainly not. No country is willing to do that. If that was the case, I think the mistake that was made was that regional countries were not consulted when they should have been, and they should have been included at that particular time. But it's still not too late. There is time to salvage the situation. At this particular time, I'll be honest with you, every regional country is out to fend for itself and to secure itself from the repercussions of Afghanistan. But if this transitional process does take place, and if it's relatively peaceful, then you're going to see these regional stakeholders move more, they're going to push up their role, and they're going to focus on economic development, assistance, and whatnot. So these are the things that are going to happen. And yes, when it comes to even, look, for example, India, I will say this again, India has a legitimate role to play in Afghanistan. They're very concerned that, the Taliban have come back and they're going to be pushed out. I don't think so. India has made a lot of, has played a big role in Afghanistan when it comes to developmental assistance, and Pakistan recognizes that. And again, it is important that regional rivalries and differences are not played out. I know this is wishful thinking, but at least it can be limited. Because what does the region need right now? It needs economic connectivity. It needs development. Every country in the region, including Sri Lanka, needs this. And I think if we learn to respect each other's places, it will pay off, because at the end of the day, if Afghanistan falls back into the black hole that it was in, we're going to see terrorism, and every country is going to, the Americans are portraying this as a regional issue, but Afghanistan has always had the seeds of a global issue, and we need to keep this in mind.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amina. Thank you very much for taking time off on a very busy day. With so much going on in Afghanistan, and also in terms of the coverage. Thank you once again for joining us on the Awarelogue Initiative on this Awarelogue Alert. As we looked at the developing situation in Afghanistan, we looked at the impact it is having, the socio-economic impact, and also looked at diplomacy and foreign policy and how it's going to unfold. And as you said, what we need is development, we need progress, we need peace in our part of the world. We've had enough. We've gone through enough. It's high time that we put a stop to it. If extra regional powers are not going to do that, it's high time that we take control of the situation in our own respective countries. And as you said, respect the spaces within our countries, and try to work together for the greater good of all of our countries in South Asia. Thank you very much, Amina, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Bye.